Ce soir, je te suis jusqu'à l'infini. 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 Ce soir, je te suis.
This seminar will consider Michel Foucault's Psychiatric Power, Lectures 4, 5, and 6, with an introduction by Dr. Luke Alexander Buckley on the problems of power, individuality, freedom, domination, and liberation, and so is useful for any student of Foucault's work, whether you have done the reading or not. Greats in thought. Read, riff, rapscalionate. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Greats in thought.
Okay. Fucking hell. Well, that was quite the cock up of an intro, but, you know, hey ho, let's go. You know, finally, you know, once we'll say it will be fixed next time. And actually, it will be fixed.
Well, keep
next
finding
time.
new ways to profit from your failures.
Patrick, you're a little bit quiet, so if you could.
Am I really?
Yeah.
How do I do that?
I don't know.
Speak louder.
You see if you can work it out while I do my little intro in regards to last seminar. So, in the last seminar, we got ourselves into a bit of a tangle. It's partly my fault. I chose this lecture series to begin with precisely because it is not only the first, but in a sense the clearest, most legible or graspable articulation of what Foucault means when he talks about power. Most students, often not of Foucault himself as such, but his works springing up from the deep into their discipline, begin with Discipline and Punish, or The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Now, they were published 3 or 4 years after this lecture series, and is where his kind of aventure amoureux with power is, well, surfaced at that time. And students who begin with these books rather than the lectures often end up in a flat spin from which there is no recovery. But the smart GITs here, that's you two, have already clocked the fundamental problems of Foucault's work during this middle period. Problems which will take 7 years for him to resolve in the 1979 to 1980 lectures on the government of the living, finally appearing in print a full decade later in the History of Sexuality, Volume 2, which begins somewhat playfully with a chapter called Modifications. So there'll be a Greats in Thought special on this manoeuvre, unique in the history of philosophy, in a few months' time when we get to those books and then that lecture series. But having got you into a muddle, I've got to get you out. So, per the principles of the seminary format, I can't do so merely by lecturing you, but only by serving as your guide, so as to aid your own reading, understanding, thought, and comprehension. So this is a short introduction by me, so we can find a way to look at Foucault's work, such that moving with him, we can continue to think and wrestle alongside him, reimagining our present moment in the form of agon and confrontation or joust, just as he did, but in our present moment, and without the examination grotesque of, yes, there are answers, yes, of course, they're at the back of the book, but please don't look. So last time, well, the GIT spotted a crucial problem with his work on power. It's most manifest in the problematic status of the individual, choice, freedom, agency, domination, liberation, etc. But the notion of the individual in Foucault's work is very peculiar. Firstly, because the individual that Foucault is talking about or considering, though obviously connected to the normative or real sense of the term individual, an individual, is nonetheless the individual or individuality as it appears in the object of Foucault's studies directly considered, the archive. And there's a kind of slippage here that you should be careful of. And that's between the tableau or taxonomy, schema of class, status, identification, broadly put, which founds, to a certain extent, in any moment of time, the possibilities of being something, those somethings which you can be, that even when it is a matter of choice, it's still a choice between extant things, some things that exist around you, a nurse, a fireman, a good guy, a dickhead. These are all some things that you can, to a greater or lesser extent, choose to be. But the thinginess of the something is beyond you. That thing that makes it what it is beyond your choice. You can participate in it, be good or bad at it, even master it. Yet the it that Foucault studies, obviously essential to any notion of individuality, freedom, domination, liberation, is never a choice as such in and of itself to be something else entirely. And even when it is, that being something else is related by degrees of proximity to the limit point of correspondence, coterminosity, transparency, or, on the other side, by negation, to the degree zero of absolute refusal, of completely rejecting that something in order to be something other. So the real, or the what is, which is not contained within the archive that is the object of Foucault's studies, escapes, slips past, passes through, or is ignored by the tableau, the schema, the taxonomy, and is not here at least directly implicated, strictly speaking, in Foucault's analysis at all. So we can consider this from a different angle if we look at the parable with which Foucault begins his thesis, published as The History of Madness. Is a very short story that illustrates the absurdity of a denotational epistemology, or a kind of knowledge or understanding in which Knowledge corresponds to things. That is, in some way, knowledge and things should strive towards equivalence. That knowledge points to things, names them, labels them. And remember that, of course, the sequel to The History of Madness, which sold out in a week and became an immediate bestseller in France back in the day, is Les mots et les choses, or words and things. Better translated, I think. Foucault begins The History of Madness then, reeling with laughter, as he reads us the following passage from Borges. The story is called Rigor in Scientia, or On Exactitude in Science. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the space of an entire city, and the map of an empire occupied the space of the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided with it point by point. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. Foucault's object of study, then, if you think a little, anyone's object of study could never be, truly speaking, the real or the what is. He's not a social scientist nor shares their naivety. Put another way, Foucault's object of study is only the real or the what is, insofar as it manifests itself in the archive, insofar as it is written down. There is nowhere that Foucault says he is talking about real individuals as we understand them as such. He is not an anthropologist. He refuses the title of philosopher, and later will remark with a wry grin, "Oh, I'm sure they found some box or another to put me in by now." So Foucault is, in a slippery way, talking about the tableau, the taxonomy, the archive, and the individual as they appear as such in the object of his study, vis-a-vis archives, records that are written down, maintained, kept and stored, which only by a leap in thought relates to individuality in the normative sense. So, as a guide to direct you in what I believe to be the right or quicker or more pleasant or convenient way of reading Foucault, you have to suspend yourself a little and give these ideas room to breathe or hover. I mean, this is why he loves Flaubert so much. Because, of course, Flaubert invents realism. He's the first, as far as Foucault is concerned at least, to write the common man, the petty bourgeoisie, the banal, the trivial, the ordinary and the everyday, into the archive, in and through the greatness of his writing, to carve out, in a way, the private and the normal and make it public, to generalize or put into circulation the peculiar or the idiosyncratic. There is no reality TV without Gustave Flaubert, no Big Brother, no Love Island, no Married at First Sight, no Changing Places or Garden Force. And to double down on this point, what is the limit of these shows? What is their maximum extension or expressive degree zero? It is, of course, the celebrity version, where the already known, in whichever way they are famous, are taken out of their usual role or persona and revealed or unclothed, as it were, disclosed, perhaps, in their individuality, in their peculiarity, in their ordinary everyday, or simply put, in the domain we often call the real. Second response regarding individuality, agency, choice, freedom, liberation, domination. What does it mean to be an individual other than to be subject, to be subjected to various obligations, responsibilities, and demands? These can be made by abstract or concrete organizational complexities or assemblage, even other subjects themselves, And what word do we use to problematize a claim as lacking objectivity? Subjective. Oh, it's all subjective. I find that comment from you rather subjective. The word or concept of subjective has a rich and varied grammar, which unfortunately, as with many words, has been reduced in the main to a speech act, a manoeuvre of verbal kung fu, a doing not a saying, a semblance not significance, through which, without thought nor reason, a claim felt to be uncomfortable, unorthodox, disagreeable, etc., can be comfortably dismissed, held at bay, covered in bubble wrap or protective foam, kept at a safe distance, negated or refused. Its limit point is caesura. Like the Spanish phrase ya está, it often has the intent and effect of bringing the conversation to a close. How ironic, then, that we consider our subjectivity as the heart of our individuality and power, viz., the very thing that escapes objective determination and so power, enters our own realm of freedom and choice precisely to the extent that it is subjective, dismissible, and therefore lacking power. If it is objective, then subjectivity can have nothing to say. A brilliant reversal, more details of which you can find in my thesis on the essay on opinion. But back to the subject, subjection, and subjectivity as the site of multiple subjections. We can say that, to the extent to which one is consumed by these subjections, to the limit point of transparency, we might say, normatively speaking, that you lack individuality as a typical banker, a typical American, a typical builder, a classic dad, etc. On the other side, there is the question of the extent of that subjection, vis-a-vis your refusal, resistance, reticence, negation, and so negotiation, or, differently put, how far we go in denying these various subjections, these variform assemblages that try to make us subject to ourselves, our bodily needs, our desires, family, state, culture, religion, as brother, son, father, acolyte, priest, employee, boss, etc. Is it not precisely the site of normatively considered individuality, the space of negotiation between various subjections, in which it might be argued that there is a degree of freedom or choice as to which modalities of subjection we submit to, the extent to which they take hold of us, and how we negotiate this Gordian web of complexity vis-a-vis each and every calling, as Cavell might put it. And there is an obvious truth, in a way, to what Foucault is beginning to get at here. How many people have you met at university who said, oh, I'll work in finance for however many years, I'll become a partner of a law firm for however many years, I'll start a business and make however many millions, then I'll quit and live my life. How many have actually done it, come out unscathed or unchanged in the process? None and neither. They are all still working to get the bigger bonus in finance, to become a partner in law, to make more millions in business, and working so hard for so many hours, putting in so much of themselves, their subjectivity as the site mise en scène for veriform subjection. Well, in these kind of environments, it cannot help but rub off on them, to the extent that, in many cases, I hardly even recognise that sprightly spirit, dreamy-eyed thinking in wistful reverie, beyond the job to the freedom of life and choice after. They're still there, stuck, plugging away, but changed, different, their dreams darkened and fading into the distance at twilight. It's as water takes the shape of a jug, whilst not being in and of itself jug-shaped, having been poured into a vessel, it becomes so, and a change in temperature is all it takes to keep it that way forever, or of course to bubble over, boil, explode. So, to avoid tripping over the object of Foucault's investigations, the archive, it is helpful to understand the individual, not in its debased and demeaned normative sense, as if Gary Barlow and I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here is somehow closer to the real Gary, but to understand the individual as subject, their subjectivity being the site of multiple subjections, such as functions, roles, jobs, whatever. But what about power? What is the role of power here? And specifically in this lecture series, disciplinary power. Well, in order for a subject to be subjected such that they function in the way that is desired or determined, they must be attached in some way, bound, fixed, fastened, such that power can do its work. Disciplinary power, then, is the third term, the plus in the sum that equals. It is that which binds the subject to the function such that a coupling is formed between the two, subject-function. Disciplinary power is the third term and operator by means of which the subject-function coupling is brought together, such that subject plus function equals subject-function. And is this word subject not, in the end, much more useful than individual? Because individuality is very tightly controlled, and it owes no purchase as to its specificity or origins. You might be free to express your individuality with certain styles, shapes, colours of clothes, for example, but try walking around the city naked or dressed in ancient costume. Immediately, a whole array of what you might call panoptic procedures, punishments, will come into effect in the form of rebuke, shame, laughter, shock, disgust, reproach, even violence. And as Deleuze remarked in his commentary, are not those moments of life that are most important, most definitive, most formative or shaping, precisely those moments when a subject confronts an attempt, successful or no, to bind it to a function, to precisely, therefore, those moments of refusal, precisely those moments of negation, which are, of course, obviously, at one and the same time, moments of self-assertion. Just like when you say, in the opposite direction at a wedding, I do. So, two final points. What I advocate is a loose reading of Foucault, because what exactly the denotational content of his work is certainly at this moment unclear. It is unclear at this stage to him other than in its object form. And certainly, if it is unclear at this stage for Foucault, it should be a thick mist of fog for us all. So walk slowly, tread lightly, and be open to what reveals itself in the mist. Second movement, the equal sum. He's writing this in the 70s, just after the 60s, where apparently everything was liberated, everything was freed, everything was, as it were, set into circulation. And this was what you might call a strong movement. One could not imagine our present moment without it. Yet, does today resemble that moment, its goals, ambitions, aims, outcome? Have we achieved what might be described as its objectives? No, absolutely not. Sexual relations are in complete crisis, gender in crisis, society writ large is having a panic attack. But how, in that moment, 1973, do you criticise, put a spanner in the works of something that to you is so obviously absurd yet so steadfastly believed in? Well, if it is a strong movement, you need a strong critique to wrestle it back to a zero sum or pull it to the negative. As Marx might have put it, the point of life is not to interpret the world, but to change it. And Foucault is making an intervention into his present moment in order to try and effect the change. And my God, change it Foucault has. But we'll come to that in a later seminar. Right, enough from me. Chaps?
Hello.
One sec, Patrick. Sorry. You just have to start again. You were muted.
I was muted. Is that right now? Okay. All right, good. Yeah, no, while you were talking, I was thinking of various other examples, some of which have already actually fascinated Foucault. I know that in Les Mots et les Choses, like, he riffs on that like Borges' parody of classification, you know. And I can't remember exactly, but it's some story about a Chinese emperor who devises a particular kind of encyclopedia for the classification of animals, okay? And there are a whole load of like bizarre ways of categorizing them, like, you know, needs his hair brushed, you know, in a horizontal direction, drinks milk, is more than 6 foot tall, lives in the jungle, leaves his mother at birth. They're all these kinds of like the categories that don't fit together, that don't tessellate. So I don't know how to put this, but it'll be a bit like saying, okay, only men above the age of 33 who like ham sandwiches, and have been, teetotaled for the last 5 years, go on this side. You have this idea that, that isn't a way of arranging the world, that will give the world a kind of like pattern and form and schema, and therefore will satisfy a sort of aesthetic craving for order, regularity and neatness, but nonetheless is, like, at least from our position of strangeness, a kind of absurd way of like drawing the line and cutting people down the centre. And I think that, like, one of the themes that we see throughout Foucault, and anyway, in all of our conversations we've had, like as with one another, is this idea that the world and even language itself is massively in excess of taxonomy, such that you get frequently these situations where like language or reality starts to kind of like parody the attempts that we have to categorize it or box it or taxonomize it. And I thought, like, there's a really interesting version of that, or example of that, in a play by Shakespeare, As You Like It. So I'm just going to read like a tiny little thing that I found. And basically, if I give a little bit of background, As You Like It is a kind of like, one of Shakespeare's comedies. And as usually happens, there's some younger brother or middle brother that usurps the throne and turns out to be a kind of menace and a tyrant. And in like Shakespeare's pastoral comedies, often the kind of like good guys or those people that we've staked our hope in escape into the wilderness. They go out into the woods, or they live for a temporary period of time amongst the nourishment and rejuvenation of the forest. And two of those characters, two girls, Celia and Rosalind, go with the fool, the kind of court jester, out into the forest. And so, of course, part of the comedy comes from the fact that the court jester is now experimenting with this alternative lifestyle, a lifestyle of the woodsman, the shepherd. And a real shepherd comes up to him and he says, he's called Corin, and he says, and how like you this shepherd's life, Master Touchstone? So the jester is called Touchstone already, And he says, truly, shepherd, in respect of itself, it is a good life. But in respect that it is a shepherd's life, it is naught. In respect that it is solitary, I like it very well. But in the respect that it is private, it is a very vile life. Now in respect it is in the fields, it pleaseth me well. But in respect that it is not in the court, it is tedious. As it is a spare life, look you, it fits my humour perfectly. But as there is no more plenty in it, it goes much against my stomach. And then he stops, he pauses, as if he were at that moment carried away in a kind of trance of classification, a trance of distinction making, and turns almost like indolently with a kind of aristocratic leisure to the shepherd, and he says, hast any philosophy in thee, shepherd? And I thought this is a kind of like beautiful parody of a certain kind of like philosophical mania for classification and distinctions. Because on the one hand, you could just say, well, he's parodying like the scholastic tactics of distinguishing one infinitesimal differences, discerning differences between the indiscernible. But actually, there's a kind of like deeper parody going on here. And what happens is that there's one way in which philosophy tries to use language. It tries to fix things in terms of opposites, just like, for example, the example you gave, Luke, between the subjective and the objective, between the subject and the object. And in philosophy, these take the form of polarizations, of absolute opposites, irreconcilable, fundamental differences. But when you actually start to think about the variety of ways in which the word subject and object can be used, you find they're much more versatile, mercurial, and capricious than that. And in fact, each one has a kind of astonishing, richness of variety. You can be a king's subject. You can be, as Luke said, subject to something. To have subjectivity is kind of like a good thing. I mean, it's like the foundation of personal experience, and consciousness and and phenomenological encounters. But then there's a certain sense in which you can use subjective, again, like as Luke said, in a kind of act of verbal kung fu, to shut down the conversation. And therefore, in some way, it's stigmatized, it's demonized, it's a bad thing. But in the like Touchstone's jestfulness, what he shows is that, weirdly enough, within these distinctions, so between a good life, and then, between a solitary life and a private life, which seems to be a distinction that doesn't exist, the kind of the real jest is that actually there is a distinction between a solitary life and a private life, because each word, solitary and private included, is radically singular, has its own kind of texture, has its own particular, feel or sound, which allows us, even in the moment of comedy, where there's some sense that there's no difference between the two of them, actually to hear a difference. It's a kind of like joke packaged within a joke. And here, just to link this back to what we were saying before, this theme often, you talked about Foucault's disavowal, his refusal of the name of philosopher. Well, maybe it's because, like, at a certain point, it becomes necessary to refuse the title of philosopher, because it becomes necessary to disassociate oneself from this particular way of ossifying language, of pinning language down, of not allowing language to have its own manoeuvres, to dance, how shall I put it, to flaunt itself. And what we said in one of the earlier episodes is that precisely what Foucault wants to do is he wants to kind of reintroduce that flexible, versatile, mercurial language into thought. He wants us to be able to adopt and assume the word sovereignty without knowing exactly what it might come to mean, in the course of our thinking, without knowing exactly, its limits and its potential within this art of speculation. That's what I was thinking of anyway.
It's super interesting. I'm thinking about, I'm thinking many things, but
Jakob, you're quiet.
oh yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1 second. Let's see if I can put that volume up. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hello. I mean, I must say there were a lot of things in what you were saying now that I was like, fuck, okay, I mean, I feel like I understand where you're going with it, but only partially, because it does seem to me like now I also went into, I was saying this to Luke a bit earlier, but I went into like this book by, I think she's a professor in the US, she's called Camille Robsys, and basically she studied something called institutional psychotherapy, which like this Catalan psychiatrist Tosquelles, and then of course later on we have Fanon and Guattari at this Laborde in France and all this, and this kind of movement where I mean they were all psychiatrists, right? So we're not talking here about anti-psychiatry in the kind of, or in this like hardline way, but of course they had a lot of criticism, and at moments a lot of these people were very close to Foucault. As I started reading her book, and she has this, it's called Dis-alienation for anyone who wants to read it. But she has this kind of just intellectual history chapter on Foucault and what he does. And there was a lot of things where I was like, what the fuck? Like he is like associate professor of psychology in Lille in 52, for example, where, just see if I can quote this. I found it quite interesting, just this little quote from him there. So as a professor and as the director of the Institut de Psychologie de Lille, he continued to explore in his teaching and in his own research the themes that had occupied him as a student: anthropology, phenomenology, psychoanalysis, the unconscious, alienation, and Erlebnis, or I don't know how this German word, how you say it, the specific way in which reality is here for me, speaking of what we were just talking about. But it basically, I just see this kind of, well, I'm just interested because he basically seems to do this thing where, well, okay, his parents has this friend, this couple, Vertot, and they introduce him to a lot of psychiatry and to a lot of other movements. And there's a lot of and also his first book is actually called Maladie mentale et personnalité. That's his first book published, right? And he doesn't want this to be published again. And I think it's published in 54, just as he has been to Uppsala, or just as he comes back from Uppsala, I think. So, I mean, I was just, my reaction, like, you know, reading the text so far and then putting some of this new information into the bank, I'm like, is it also just that he has kind of been working with this so long, and then he finds this kind of almost way of bypassing the question? That he finds the psychiatric power, he finds disciplinary power and all these other things where he can somehow bypass this question that he has been kind of running around for a lot. Like, I mean, he writes this introduction also to a German psychiatrist. I can't remember his name. He's called Binswanger. This also in the 50s, I think. And then I don't know. There is also this like these people at Saint Alban, which was this center, and also at Labotte, these kind of institutional psychotherapy. So basically, psychiatrists that was, I mean, they were what, friends of Fanon and Guattari, and in this kind of club, basically. And what they start saying after a while, when kind of the history of madness, as I understand it, has kind of become politicized, and people are like, oh, blah, 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 blah. And really kind of when it has sunk into the French younger, I guess, society, and where it's being kind of weaponized as a kind of a bit anti-psychiatric Bible, I think at some point. There's this movement where all these people then starts turning on Foucault and saying like that he's psychiatricidal, and that, you know, like that and he considers mental illness the marvelous manifestation of a divine madness, or more exceptionally, as the very spark of the poetic genius. I think it's A who criticizes Foucault for thinking in this way, or at least he thinks Foucault thinks in this way. And then Horry, the director of Laborde, then also in the late 60s, I think, then accuses Foucault of saying that Foucault did not understand anything about the structures of mental illness, basically. So there was a lot of kind of interesting things, I thought, when I kind of came back to that book that I had previously engaged a while back, like thinking about this thing of what is actually the operation that he does. Because I think it seems like to me that he, in the beginning, is like genuinely interested in the individual as a kind of, maybe not the individual, but he's very interested in the notion of psyche, and like goes all, what I understand, like into some kind of almost Heideggerian psychoanalysis at some point, or existential psychology kind of, that he seems very interested in. Anyway, that was a rant.
But you're reading this in the text, you mean?
You what?
You think you see this interest, this fascination in the text? Or are you talking about as part of this prehistory that you just recited?
I feel you see it in this way that he brings it up. Like he uses words like psyche and all this stuff. And to me that seems, he uses it not as if it was from the archive. Or I'm surprised, you know, like when he takes up these kind of notions of psyche and these things, I become a bit like, okay, but, and there I'm curious to hear what you think, Luke, but there my question is, okay, but are you using it as an archival thing? Because if you're using it as that, you're kind of, I mean, you're giving no place to it. You're just saying it as if it was just a word that you're, you know, that you're operating with, or that everyone's operating with. So it seems, I don't know, I feel it comes up now and again in the text, like in, you know, you see his kind of, or maybe that he's past this fascination and he has figured out a new strategy, basically, or...
Yeah, he does seem to be giving new names to things, yeah. I think you're right, yeah.
No, I mean, so a couple of, I guess, banal historical points, and then to kind of link what both of you were saying. So his he was in the first graduating class of psychiatry or psychology as a degree. It was not philosophy. It was not history. It was not anthropology. And there's an interview somewhere. I need to reread Foucault Live, which collates all of his interviews. And there's someone from a psychoanalytic background that's like, obviously, the work of Lacan, because he was, an ardent student of Lacan, like plays a major role in your work. And Foucault replies, and he kind of keeps pressing him on this, what is the relationship of your work to Lacan? And Foucault's just like, if you want to know the relationship of Lacan's work to my work, kind of like our seminar, read his books. He just kind of directs people to read Lacan. So he acknowledges the connection and the link. He doesn't, refuse it or evade it in any way. But he doesn't want to, I guess, transfigure or transcribe Lacan's thought in a new way. He wants to do something quite different. And kind of for the purposes of what we're doing, I think, and generally at this moment of his thought and looking at it in this way, it's kind of, to walk before you run, in a sense. Because, he himself is very kind of, although he comes across as very direct and very certain and very sure, in fact, upon, I guess, my third reading now, I can just see how tentative he is. And also knowing how he comes to resolve these things, like literally a decade of work later. And, and the kind of level of his work is incredible. I mean, when he's introduced, giving these lectures at Berkeley, which are phenomenal, by the way, he's described as a militant scholar, or it's either that or his work is a work that can only be described as a kind of militant scholarship. I mean, a series of lectures later, for example, that we will consider on the ancient Greek notion of parousia, which he tries to rescue from its current translation, which is like true speaking or frank speaking, and he tries to reinsert it into a really rich and complicated social practice that existed in ancient Greece. Now, in order to do this, he rereads the entire extant corpus of ancient Greek works in 1 year, and then gives his 12 weeks of lectures on the word parousia. Now, it kind of takes him a while to fully systematize it and articulate it. Even then, it takes him like 2 or 3 years. But just imagine, how there's no control F, where you can just, like control F parousia and go through the Loeb library and find all the instances. Like, he literally reread the entire ancient Greek corpus. And I think to kind of link with what Patrick is saying is that this strange epistemological plane that is occupying is actually very English in a way. And it's something that we talk about a lot, certainly in the context of, say, French, Latin. I mean, I don't know Russian. I know that German is very, very, very specific. It's almost like French that is kind of so hot it's become cold, like in that kind of paradox in physics where something goes so far in one direction it like reappears in a radically different state. And the French were obsessed with the German language precisely because of the possibility of, or the existence of, words in German. Like Schadenfreude is one that everyone knows and is a really good one, right? Because it kind of conjures something very specific, very denotational. You can very easily point to an instance of misfortune, have a feeling of pleasure. I'm in London at the moment, so the classic one is where, and I'm sure they do this on purpose, because the bus drivers in London are complete dickheads. I mean, like, the bus drivers in the north are like, you all right, how you doing? Like, friendly, right? You can have a bit of patter with them. In London, they're kind of these menacing characters behind, like perspex bulletproof screens. You know,
My experience, they're
this
kind of
is-
like blank face, slightly pissed off that you're actually getting on the bus, and then even if you say hello, they only look at you as if they're doing you a big favour.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so for me, the kind of perfect example of Schadenfreude is, you know, you're waiting for a different bus and there's someone running for the bus, right? And they're just getting there and they're just getting there, and you can almost like see the bus driver like looking in the mirror, you know. And it's just as they get almost close enough to the door that the driver shuts the door and drives off, you know. And you kind of like laugh to yourself a little bit, right? That's Schadenfreude, you know, that experience of pleasure at someone else's kind of pain, suffering, misfortune. Whereas English just isn't like that at all, you know. And that's what lends English as a language its freedom and its play, which was kind of unfortunately, or the ruination and damnation of English kind of occurred at the same moment as colonialism, right? So before then, you know, something in one town and the next town would not mean the same thing. And there was so much diversity in the kind of use and meaning of words, not just in their pronunciation, and not just in the sense that there were different words. You know, different words meant different things in different places. So if you're going to have an empire, if you're going to dominate and extract wealth from colonies, well, you need a kind of fixed and firm structure such that things mean the same thing in different places. And that's a trajectory that's continued. I mean, now to me, to a point of, you know, kind of like terror, where it's almost like flushing shit down the toilet, you know, like the spiral as the toilet narrows, the kind of acceleration, you know, the water gets quicker, and this, especially in the past 20 years or so, I'd say, this kind of condensation of meaning in the English language has become like really noticeable. And so just as a final thing, to link these points is that, well, you know, so in terms of psychoanalysis, Foucault, what he's trying to do here, which is something quite different, is that what is, you know, the kind of fundamental thesis of Lacan, you know, or what does he bring to psychoanalysis in a historical sense? Well, it's the notion that that the unconscious is structured like a language, right? The relationship between language and the unconscious is intimate to the point of transparency or absolute correspondence. And you see that in Britain and in British culture now. You know, there are far fewer characters. People are just in general more flat. And it's not just for kind of want of a greater vocabulary, though that'd help. It's that as their lives have become more determined, more organized, as the demands of work, raising of children, you know, income have become more intense, and things have become more, in economic terms, efficient, though that again is a kind of bastardization of the word, because of course efficiency only refers to something in which the outcome is the same, but the procedure of producing the outcome has in some way become you know, made less costly. Whereas in fact, in almost all cases that I see, politically, socially, economically, when they refer to efficiency, there is actually a kind of serious reduction in the quality of what is produced. So it's not a case of efficiency at all, right? Because you're not getting the same outcome.
Yeah, there's a weird thing where you get like almost a sort of fetishized efficiency, where some of the like almost like aesthetic qualities of efficiency are extracted from, you know, a dynamic in which efficiency might be called for. So let's say, you know, you go and play football. A really banal example, but one that fits. You go and play football like twice a week, okay? But it turns out that because of this football thing you got twice a week, you end up having lots of arguments with your wife. You have to sort out like problems with the kids. Someone has to look after the kids on one night, you know. And so there's a sense in which it's more efficient, i.e. somehow more smooth, you know, leading to greater levels of comfort, convenience, less conflict. It's somehow more efficient just to give up the football each week, you know. And so like, if you think about a fetishized or aestheticized efficiency having become almost like a sort of, an object of worship in our society, like, and encouraging things like, okay, well, can we streamline our existence? Can we make our existence somehow frictionless? Somehow like almost smooth to the point of an absolute slipperiness, so that we can almost like not notice going from morning to night. That's the kind of like ideal of existence now. And so weirdly, I agree with you, Luke, but I'd say there's weirdly efficiency remains, but in this kind of monstrous, like bastardized state, where it's lost contact with its own, like, I don't know how to put it, but its own telos, its own reality or something, and has just become this fetishized, aestheticized object.
But I think the reason for that is precisely because of a certain, let's say, constriction and reduction of the understood, or to bring it back to the archive, the written down, the documented. So, for example, when I was flying back from Germany, they've got rid of all the normal check-in desks, right? And you have to go through this really dehumanizing and horrible procedure of like self-check-in and doing all these things yourself. Now, not only is it the case that half the time the things don't work, that it makes the whole procedure much more stressful, right? So already the kind of true sense of efficiency is gone, because something has been added, like a negative has been added to the whole process, right? So the outcome is not the same. But also loads of moments of contingency and continuity of and pleasure and dignity and decency have been lost. That small moment of human contact where you speak to the person at check-in, and then to go right back to what I was saying at the start about the taxonomy, the tableau, the schema of classification, and the extent to which someone is, the extent to which they refuse, right? So the extent to which a bit of character, a bit of kind of soul gets out of that, in and through their, refusal to play by the lines. They might like crack a joke, or, various forms of human intimacy. So all of these things are kind of gone or lost. And it isn't just, this is the whole point, that it isn't just at the airport where these things are lost, right? So it isn't just that, that the whole thing is much more stressful, it's dehumanizing, that these, just nice moments of human contact are lost. It's also that the people who are fulfilling these much reduced functions, now merely kind of servants to machines, right? But acting as a kind of bridge or conduit, when people don't understand to work the machines, or there's some problem with it reading something, or their kind of function has been so reduced, and like the jug and the water example, that can't help but reduce crush their soul in some way. The dehumanization is kind of across the board, for the passenger, for the worker, and then where then exists the space for them to be human, to have these kind of qualities, these moments of intimacy, contact, touch, that might be through a joke, or through lending a hand, or, through a moment of thoughtfulness, consideration, compassion. All of these things kind of go out of the window in and through this debasement of the notion of efficiency.
Yeah, I think some of the most like heartbreaking, like tragic characters you see now are people that like they're probably in like their 70s, yeah, and they lived in the heyday of like random social intercourse. They worked in an airport, they could have worked in a hotel or something, and so they receive every new customer in this mode of chattiness, joviality, jauntiness. But they also know that they're dimly aware of the fact that they're now obsolete. They're now defunct, They don't have a role or place in the society anymore. So they have this, like, I don't know, there's something about their voices that always strikes me as so sad. Like voices that when they speak, they don't expect an answer, Voices that through a lack of an answer over so many years have now begun talking to themselves, And they almost like they have the kind of hollow, like frail sound of someone talking from the other side of the river Styx, someone who's not quite in our reality anymore, And I always think these they're often like old men, you know, the sort of guys that turn up sometimes to become like porters in Oxford colleges, you know, but that person transposed to another domain, you know, where there isn't, because at Oxford at least you got this idea of, oh, we're expecting something different, so, oh, look at him, you know, he's the funny Oxford porter that talks too much, you know, we can kind of indulge him and humour him for a moment. But if he turns up in the airport now, his fellow staff think he's annoying and inefficient, you know. The other customers who are used to this kind of like bleakly pragmatic moment of interaction are kind of like not ready or just like irritated by his little bits of banter. And even like teenagers think, oh, he's an old fogey, he's using lots of weird words and he's making jokes that are not funny. Like, so he lives in this state of utter like loneliness, you know, of like utter isolation. And it's heartbreaking because he's almost like he's the one holding the torch for humanity. And you think, why aren't people like encouraging this? Like this is our last chance. This is all we've got now, you know.
And I think though, you know, also it's funny because I don't know if either of you guys have watched White Lotus, right? But
Watched it
if you
too,
watch
the
White
first
Lotus,
season,
which
yeah.
is, you know, this kind of huge cultural phenomena, I was watching White Lotus and I was thinking, and it just came to me now, like a second ago. I was like, this show is crap. You know, it's a fucking shit show. Like, why is everyone in love with it? Well, because White Lotus is precisely what we're talking about. You know, it's kind of the you know, Gary Barlow in I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, but applied to this what Patrick kind of elaborated on a little bit, where, you know, it's this super kind of luxe resort for very wealthy people, and these people have to, you know, adopt these very strict, you know, personas, roles, right, in respect of the guests, who, being kind of flat and empty themselves, expect a kind of, but then it tries in and through moments of very artificial crisis. You know, it has none of the warmth of a similar drama that would have been made 20 or 30 years ago. It feels kind of like fake, plastic, artificial, but people absolutely love it, and I think they absolutely love it precisely because of, you know, what this conversation has become about, right? Because it shows this tension, or a tension between the individual that's outside of the kind of the specification, right? You know, through like one of the it's the first day of one of the people who works in the resort. I mean, they all have these kind of like their roles are actually not specific in the way you might expect them to be. But I think it's in the first or second episode. Spoiler alert. I think it's in the first or second episode where, you know, her water breaks, and yeah, you know, she starts going into labour in the middle of a shift. And then there's a shot of the guy who's like the manager of the place, and he kind of, you know, almost trips up on this water that's on the floor and gets angry about it, you know, and kind of like demands that it be cleaned up. And then later on in the show, you know, he realizes that she's pregnant. There's no connection made between the water on the floor, by the way, and her being pregnant. But he has this moment of kind of, you know, thoughtfulness and reflection where he's like, God, what kind of person am I? You know, I've been worrying about all this, you know, bullshit and crap, serving these, you know, rich fucking idiots all day who I hate and despise. And I didn't even notice that, you know, one of my staff was really heavily pregnant, you know, to the stage of just about to go into labour. And I think, yeah, it's interesting in the context of what I was saying about, you know, both a narrowing and an acceleration. I mean, you could imagine that this is precisely the drama that would emerge in this moment, where what Foucault was merely hinting at in the 70s has now, at a certain state of kind of like velocity, torque, pressure, has really, you know, come to be. Where, yeah, I mean, if you think of, you know, where we used to work, you know, the aptly named Caesar, our boss, Like she hired us for precisely the reason that we were kind of like characters, you know, that we had individuality, that we weren't the kind of people who, you know, just performed a role in a strict sense. But those places have just become so few and far between, and those moments of, you know, humanity, soul, thoughtfulness, compassion, intimacy have become rarer and rarer and rarer and rarer. And then I think what's interesting is, I guess, maybe to put it back in, you know, throw you the ball, is that in terms of disorder, this manifests itself as a kind of psychic disturbance, right? In which, when people's expectations aren't met, when things don't go according to the schema, when people step outside of the tableau, it can manifest quite easily as a moment of, you know, of crisis. You know, like the people can become like really angry, really stressed over the smallest thing, and very easily and very quickly. So to kind of throw it back into the domain of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, which, you know, Foucault was probably trying to get away from, in a therapeutic sense, you know, as a physician or practitioner, there's still some value to this, you know, to think in these terms, because of the discussion that we've just had, right? Because to help to help someone get out of this state in which they're constantly expecting certain things, and therefore, you know, this leads to, you know, anxiety, panic attacks, depression, you know, all sorts of disturbances of what you might call the psyche. Well, you would, in my view at least, you'd have to think of this historical moment where the things that you know, previously were everywhere and all around have been reduced, constrained, or, you know, just eliminated altogether.
Can I say something to this?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like, when you were speaking, it's because I don't want to do exactly what I'm going to say now, but it's really interesting, I think, that none of you mentioned to optimize, right? Optimization. And I was just going to suggest, like I was thinking earlier today, that, okay, how does this stand, you know, not to, I think maybe it's a stupid idea to continue this idea that I feel everyone in critical theory at some point contemplates, right? What is the next society, you know? But there is really something about, and I think optimization fits this very well, better than efficiency, like better than improvement or this thing. There is something very much about optimizing.
Yeah, like optimal functioning, you know.
Yeah, but in the same way that
in a kind of abyss, in a kind of vacuum, you know.
Yeah, but in the same way that you were talking about, you know, the like, it has so many levels, right? But in the sense that to optimize always means to compress and to lose stuff. You never end up with the same thing as with efficiency, right? You always lose when you optimize, I think. Cut out the unnecessary shit or these kind of things.
All of this talk of optimization has just triggered in me. You know, it's like when you need a piss and you get to your front door and all of a sudden, you know, you have this like crisis of finding the right key. You can't get it in. You jump in, you hop in. Because of my lack of optimization vis-a-vis this video, I need to take a quick piss.
Yeah, do that.
Though it's only 3 meters away this time.
Yeah.
So I'll be back very shortly.
We don't have to watch.
So no. So I'm sure I'll be able to
episode
you know, like
6,
jump on whatever kind of moving vehicle that you two have conjured in the 20 seconds that I'll take. All right.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think though, just to kind of go back to Foucault, that this idea of, I don't know how to put it, but let me just say a phrase, like, let's say the ordinary world used to be that world that was kind of unclassified, in which, you know, that exists. I don't know how to put it, but when do you actually hang around and laugh and joke and jest with your kids? Well, it's in like these kind of non-moments. Yeah, you're not doing anything in particular. You haven't got an assigned activity. Yeah, you haven't got a chore to carry out. You haven't got a duty to perform. You're just kicking around in the house, or you're like, oh, do you want to go? Oh, I think I'm going to go and get like the microphone I got today. Do you want to come with me? And then we're walking on the road, and you know, my little kid like says to me, "Tell me a story," and I tell him a story, and then he wants to define a word that's going into it, and this turns it like kind of unfurls into this like colossal conversation that makes me forget like what I'm doing in completely the wrong place about half an hour later, you know. And so like, and I think like these non-moments, like they used to characterize the ordinary, these non-moments have ceased to exist because the ordinary has become schematized, has become like heavily classified, has become massively overdetermined. And I'll give you an example. Again, I keep like doing this because obviously I'm a dad, so I'm condemned to extract and derive examples from my life as parent. But it happens in parks all the time. And I think it's a nice object demonstration of what Foucault means when he's trying to link together individualization, and let's forget about, like, just for now, this idea of individuality and the individual, but think about individualization as like sequestering or isolating someone, or like almost like separating him out from social or communal or festive connections, and a link between that and then this schematization, classification. Now, a lot of the time, I'm just like, I'm hovering in the background of the park, watching my kids playing, kind of like almost like musing or captivated by their antics or their mischief or something. And then there's a moment that's slightly where the tension kind of peaks, like one kid hits another kid, you know, or one kid says something that has like a dodgy sound to it, taken out of context, you know. And suddenly there's this thing where from like the four corners of the park, all the parents pop out, you know, and they like take into custody their own kid. And there's almost like a spontaneous, like, not exactly a court of law because there's no like debate really, but a spontaneous attempt to take control of the situation and to legislate the reality, to name and say, this is the thing that happened, you know. So instead of, and this weirdly it often happens at a really beautiful moment in a way. Like, let's say one kid pushes another kid on the floor, okay? Now, if you rush in just at that moment and you try to be like, okay, this needs to be disciplined, that kid shouldn't, no pushing, zero tolerance policy on pushing, you know, and, you know, we don't do violence. Oh, you pushed him first. Okay, wait, then you shouldn't also push, you know, and let's bring them together and we have this ceremony of kind of like moral legislation. Instead, if you just like back off for a minute, there's a chance in which the kids can kind of sort things out by themselves. Maybe one kid feels like kind of shame and humiliation and tries to walk off, and another kid like bumps into him and is like, no, look, you just pushed him over. And this kid who's on the floor kind of like gets up and maybe makes a spontaneous apology for having pushed him in the first place, you know? And there's like a renewed bond or connection between them. Or maybe one kid goes off into a corner, sulks for ages in a state of like mind rack confusion because he doesn't really understand what went on, why he had this like feeling of violence surge through him, and why it evinced itself in this like moment where he pushed the kid over, and why all the other kids turned away from him at that moment, you know. Some things take a while to digest and swallow, like but like they can be worked out in a kind of rich, complex and inventive way amongst the kids themselves. As soon as you've got the adult intervention, which is always like clumsy and stupid, like the adults have not even been watching what's going on. They've no idea what's happening. I remember one time, like my kid, let me finish this. As soon as you get the adult intervention, you just get legislation, you just get labeling, you just get classification. And then you get to the point that's a point where the actual event takes place. Now we're at the point where there's a ceaseless, like pervasive surveillance that stops those events from happening in the first place. So like, I remember, I think on a previous like episode, I gave the anecdote about this guy who was like sweeping his kid up away saying, no, he doesn't want a biscuit. You know, his little daughter was running out with kind of 2 biscuits ready to give one to Roman. And he's like, no, he doesn't want a biscuit, and kind of like scooped him off and whisked him away and brought him back to a corner again. I bump into the same man yesterday and he's doing the same thing. He's like, no, we don't go near the water fountain. You know, and it's just like, it's absurd. Why don't you give biscuits out, and why don't you go near the water fountain? And like, the water fountain is not going to kill anyone, you know. And also, the kid is like 1 year old. They're not even going to be able to turn on the water fountain. But it's this incredible, like as Luke was saying, this incredible psychic disturbance that's led to a sort of massive lesion in the mind, you know, a massive wound. That as soon as you step like one, nano step or pigeon step towards disaster, people kind of like, their spidey senses go wild, like, you know, and they swoop in and they stop that catastrophe from occurring. And one way of talking about that catastrophe, the thing that's a catastrophe, is that it's unnameable, that we can't, like the push is a kind of singularity. We don't know what's going on there, you know. And another kind of singularity is the porter or the stranger that comes into the park. We can't name him. We don't know who he is. Or the joke, we can't name it. We don't know what it is. Is it offensive? You know, is the irony directed at me? You know, is he sneering? Is he snarling? You know, or is it playful? Is it pleasant? I don't know. I'm like freaking out now. You know, I'm going into like spasmodic overload, and so I'd rather just walk away from the guy who made that joke rather than seeking to understand. You know, or waiting around while he unfurls his personality. And I think that's one of the ways in which we've seen the flattening out of like the everyday, or the flattening out of the ordinary. And I do think that leads to individualization, because if you listen to the scenario I'm talking about, it's like each parent is like kind of, I'm going to say, hyper responsible for their kids, you know, as in like the question of responsibility is not posed, because maybe I have a responsibility to like keep away, not to like, you know, if I pose the question of responsibility to myself, I might come up with a different answer, but they don't. They act on kind of like in kind of like terms of like, you know, Borges' terminology, a kind of simulacrum of responsibility. I must demonstrate responsibility. I must convince all the other people here that I'm doing the thing that parents should do, that gets called responsible parenting. Therefore, it becomes hyper responsibility, because you're no longer posing the question of responsibility. And so I do think like you know, you can see this link between a disciplinary order like infiltrating, sweeping into the ordinary, and also individualized responsibility, like such that even I'm like Roman pushes over another guy and I'm like, fuck, I'm gonna have to like and I'm trying to like intervene in their moments of interpretation, trying to like laugh it off, and then I'm like, shit, I'm now doing that thing. That's kind of like just a comic version of interpretation. Like I'm telling them what to think about this event, you know. I'm not backing off, you know. And it's incredible. It's so hard to back off, to be like sitting down in a corner while there's a fight going on between kids and be the only adult not like intervening. Like it's basically impossible. Like there's such an enormous amount of like psychological disturbance that takes place that I think at some point I just have to get up, even if I have to mellow and pacify these mad people. Like, you know, I'm still there in a way that I don't want to be, really, you know. I'm still the individual taking care of this individual. Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because you know, Foucault didn't really have any students that you know, usually a guy like Foucault, with a mind like Foucault, would have a kind of, you know, coterie of you know, kind of obsessive students who would take on his ideas, take on his work. I mean, there's no shortage of people who have done that, but they were very rarely in kind of direct contact or connection with him. So, you know, the present moment of feminism, the trans movement, gender as fluid and performative, is just unthinkable without Foucault, because it's unthinkable without Judith Butler and Judith Butler's notion of gender as a performance. And Judith Butler was a huge reader of Foucault, a huge fan of Foucault, a misreader, I would say. I think she completely misunderstands him and what he's getting at and what he's trying to do. But he's kind of only real notable student as such, you know, as you would think of as like, you know, like Husserl and Heidegger or Hegel and Marx, is a guy called Jacques Donzelot. And he wrote this book called On the Policing of Families. And I kind of reinsert this into like a broader history that fascinates me, which is the history of Enclosure, and the movement from you know, a kind of feudal agrarian society to an industrial society. So an easy way to think of it is that in criminology we have this notion. I mean, it's a kind of you know, we've talked before about Perescues, so, you know, it's not something to hold on to. And we've also talked earlier today about, you know, reading loose. So it's useful, but it's not something to really kind of, you know, dig at in an academic way and, you know, kind of pick the, you know, point out all the small flaws in the texture. It's called like primary, secondary, tertiary mechanisms of social control. So if you think in a small farming village, everyone knows each other, right? So social control is affected kind of, you know, almost like all the time, every day, you know, where you walk, where you go to work, where you know, when you go to the pub. There's, you know, an incredibly rich network of social control, of keeping people in check, of, you know, all of these things that I talked about before, if someone does a certain thing, it becomes shameful or disgusting or disgraceful, or other things are categorized as good, and these appellations, they become the subject of conversation, of gossip, which is exactly what Flaubert begins or introduces as an object into the archive. But then when you move into the city, all of a sudden there's this anonymity, right? And I think maybe that's a bit of the historical background that's missing, that will come in later lecture series, because of course the moment of disciplinary power is at the same time the moment of the industrial city, and it's responding to all sorts of social breakdowns, the alcoholism. If you think medicine, so around this time he wrote on the birth of the clinic. And if you think of medicine and the constitution of the medical object, well, what problems does it respond to? Well, it's the diseases and illnesses that are caused precisely by industrial capitalism. Now, at this moment, the woman is almost robbed from nature, robbed from a certain essence of femininity, and she becomes quite literally a node or relay for state power. Now, it's definitely the case now, but back then when it came about, it was all of a sudden it was actually a kind of a source of power for women, in which they had to make sure that the kids got up and were well dressed for school, that they went to church on Sunday in their as they would say Sunday best, their best clothes, that they adopted certain manners of speech, behavior, that were normatively considered to be good or excellent, or the thing that was done. So I think what's missing from psychiatric power, which when we get to Society Must Be Defended, so the lecture series after the next, what really comes to the fore is this problem of industrialization, of this movement from the countryside, of primary mechanisms of social control, and then disciplinary power and the institutions that kind of exemplify it. The prison, the school, the workhouse, the factory, all of the forms of disciplinary power that Foucault talks about really come into effect at precisely this moment as what you would call secondary forms of social, as a secondary form of social control, because the primary ones have gone away. A kind of little pub quiz tidbit is that it was often thought that the work of the factory required a certain delicatesse, a certain finesse that was more typical of women and children, who had finer hands, finer fingers, more attention to small detail than men. And this is actually, that is the general story. And now, funnily enough, that might, arguably be the case, right? At the level of population, say you work in a fabrication factory in Malaysia that makes Louis Vuitton bags, it probably is the case that, and I'm not sure if there are any studies on this, I'm sure there are, that if you took 1,000 men and 1,000 women, that the quality of the product would be better if it was produced by women or young children, or even young women, than it would be if it was produced by 30-year-old males. But at that time, the machines were, let's just say, kind of clunky, truculent. They didn't require these skills, this delicatesse, this finesse at all. And the reason for the mass use of labor in the factories of women and children was because the men refused the indignity of wage labor, that they refused this kind of dehumanizing quality of working in a factory, of working in industry. And so if you think that's why, that's why the school in America, so the disciplinary institutions generally, when I was doing my research in the archives for my work in the school, you have these incredible documents that similar to what Foucault considers, that are the founding documents for a school or a workhouse or a hospital, and they're always made by these societies, generally run by women. In fact, interestingly, like the Society for Moral Reform or the Society for the Prevention of Alcoholism. And at that time, there was no bones about what the school was for. The school was to produce a moral, obedient, and industrious populace, right? They didn't have to hide it behind notions of knowledge, liberation, freedom, income, earnings. They just wrote it right down, in the kind of blueprint or proposal for the school. And one of the kind of major operators, certainly in the United States, to generalize the school to the populace was who? J.D. Rockefeller. A vast proportion of the original schools in the United States were funded by J.D. Rockefeller. Why? Well, to inculcate into these students, to inculcate in them a certain attitude, a certain set of demeanors, a certain sense of life, in which factory labor, upon which his wealth, his riches, his power depended, to produce the laborers that he required to enhance, augment, or minimally maintain, his position as a rich and wealthy industrialist.
That's interesting. What I think is also interesting, like again, just like another kind of anecdotal thing, is that about probably several decades after the period in which you've just described, you have this culture of macho one-upmanship entering the factory as well, where for some weird reason, like thinking about what you just said there, that you have this movement from a rejection of factory work as demeaning, as dehumanizing, as kind of disgraceful, to a sort of competitiveness, like within the context of factory work, such that the person who does the least is kind of, well, it's not, again, we've received another evolution now, but the person who does the least is momentarily for a period of time, like kind of snubbed, looked down on, kind of like stigmatized, as someone who's not pulling his weight and these kinds of things. So there's a certain kind of morality which enters the factory place, which is quite clearly, in a weird way, an example of what like Marx would call false consciousness, where something that's clearly very good for Mr. Rockefeller, is being, it's not just that they're doing his work at the level of like manufacture, they're also doing his work at the level of morals as well. They're being like one another's stewards, one another's wardens, and actually valorizing and glorifying overwork, the very work that their grandfathers thought was demeaning. And I think that's
Yes,
right.
it's funny. It's funny that you bring that up because when I was at Oxford, I met at a graduate level one working class guy. Right? Can you imagine that? Right, in 7 years at Oxford, I met people from all over the world, but literally one working class guy. And when I was at Edinburgh, I guess because of my background and my upbringing, I was always kind of constitutionally a feminist, right? I was brought up by women, and I had like an innate concern for women, for women's rights, etc. I decided to take this course, Gender and Justice, and I ended up getting this ridiculous mark. It was like the best mark that they'd ever awarded at the law school in Edinburgh. It was 2 whole grade classifications above the closest mark. It was a 91, and the next mark closest to mine was a 71. So it was like 2 firsts higher than a first class. And in that class there was me, a gay guy, and the whole rest of the class were women, right? And when I was like the award ceremony for this thing, for having won this prize and stuff, a woman came up to me and she said, "Oh, Luke, it was a magnificent paper, and one of the best papers that I've read from a student, blah 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 blah. But the grade that you got was kind of fake, right? It's like a fake grade." And I was like, "What do you mean, like a fake grade?" And she said, "Oh, we thought that the head of the law school had sat the exam to test the marking scheme, right?" And the head of the law school at that time was Professor Leslie Macara, who's a kind of world-renowned criminologist and a woman. And I thought, wow, what better compliment could you get? I sat a gender course. I was the only straight guy who was, I don't straight guy. I was the only straight guy who was on the course amidst all these women. And not only did they get this ridiculous grade, they thought that I was a woman. But so I studied it was split into 2 semesters. So I studied the whole kind of history of feminism, feminist thought, feminist theory in the first semester. And the second, it was all applied to in this case, the justice system. So we looked at things like rape, domestic violence, all sorts of stuff. It was really interesting. Anyway, so when I met this guy at Oxford, the only working class guy that I met at Oxford, and somehow, I don't know, at Oxford at a graduate level, interesting people who do interesting things, they always end up in the wrong place somehow. So I was in the criminology department of the law faculty as an anthropologist researching education who was really interested in philosophy, right? Kind of wild. He was in geography, and we had that, that kind of the ubiquitous, oh well, so what are you, what's your research? What are you interested in? And it's kind of like a movement again away from what Patrick was saying. He was like, well, my problem is what happens to masculinity when the working shop floor becomes a call center. So it's kind of in a funny way, and I worked in a number of call centers, and it immediately struck me as a kind of brilliant project, because part of my problem with the history of feminist thought was, well, what about men? What about masculinity? Because all feminist thought and theory really talks about until the 90s with Beverly Skeggs, or Bev as she prefers to be called, which I quite like. It's called Formations of Class and Gender. I thought that his kind of problem and research site was really brilliant. But then again, like you were saying, Patrick, when I worked in call centers, there was kind of a particular kind of, the English word would be like banter, kind of playfulness, like mocking, insults, there was a peculiar way in which masculinity had kind of transfigured and repurposed itself from, the valorization of trade that you talk about, into the kind of context of, a call center where, you have certain targets and satisfaction ratings and numbers to fill and, all this kind of stuff. There was a kind of another almost you could call it the third or fourth turn of masculinity as it kind of progresses in and through these different socio-economic institutional contexts, and is maintains some of itself, but is nonetheless modified, transformed, in very important and significant ways.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I mean, unless, do you have something to say, Jakob?
Yeah, peeps. Let's can we skip the anecdotes for a while now? Fucking hell. But let's talk about the text a little bit. Not to interrupt you, but I mean, it's very interesting. But I feel we can also talk the whole session about other things. But I just wanted to say, maybe a bit on topic actually, but. What did you think? I mean, Luke, maybe I don't know if you have this fresh, but Patrick sure does. But towards the end of the 6th lecture, Foucault comes to this point of simulation, where he sort of starts talking about that this is the kind of, the core of the kind of psychiatric problem in the 19th century, or the cross that psychiatric... the psychiatric system has to carry, kind of. And what do you think of that? Because it left me a bit I was like, oh, what the fuck are you saying here? And you're also kind of concluding with this point, and he's not very. I mean, maybe he is meticulous about it. Maybe it's just me not fully understanding it.
Isn't that one of the things? One of the ways I try to explain that to myself is riffing and following on something that Luke had said in the previous week about this idea that power only shows itself in its when it's resisted, when someone attempts to overturn it, when there's a kind of a moment of friction or agony, or like almost like the moment of failure in power. Okay, so that means that there's this reciprocal relationship on the one hand between disciplinary power and then the moment where disciplinary power is dodged or evaded or resisted by its object. So I think that's why Foucault is saying that this idea of simulation is fundamental to disciplinary power. Now, why is disciplinary power confronted by simulation? Well, his explanation for that is, for me, is immensely interesting. That one of the changes that he notices, like from the beginning, again, if you read it, but that he notices from the beginning of psychiatry, or like classical psychiatry, as he calls it, whether it's psychiatry or not at that point, I don't know. But anyway, this like classical way of dealing with madness, what he calls the game of truth, is this idea that, okay, fine, within the psychiatric treatment itself, how should I put it? Like truth and falsehood play a role, okay? So there's some sense in which, all right, you've got this guy, who thinks, one of the ones from the previous lectures, who thinks that his nurse is trying to kill him or something, and she's like dressed, isn't that right? She's dressed him in a kind of top that's like full of poison, isn't it? Yeah.
No, yeah, that's
weird actually. Because that's the
text.
third reference to Hercules so far. But anyway, so she's dressed him in this top that's like meant to be poisonous. So what they do is they organise a kind of like a fake simulated trial, and get like police officers to come in, and they like do a fake forensic analysis on the top, and they say, yeah, okay, fine, no, this is right, it does have traces of poison in, and then there's this big pageant where the nurse is walked out in shame and so on. And I can't remember the exact ending, but he gets news that she's locked away in some dungeon somewhere beyond recovery, or she's been executed or something. And so anyway, the way that Foucault understands, he says two things. One, the kind of, you satisfy the delirium, okay? So, and I think it's kind of clever in a way, because what you do is the delirium has kind of, it's gone off the rails, it's become unhinged, dislocated from reality. So what you do is you try to make a point of intersection between the delusion and reality, okay? And that's like a kind of back door for the guy who's suffering from the delusion back into reality. If you think that, okay, fine, the police are willing to listen to me, and forensic analysis is on my side, it's like the apparatus of science and the apparatus of law, that constitute reality are with me on this one. They're complicit with me. They agree with me. So now I can kind of step out of my delusion and I can come back into the world again. All right. Anyway, the other thing that Foucault says is that there's an attempt. He says another thing that's interesting, but I'll leave that for a second. But at least there's an attempt here to keep the question of truth open within the cure. Okay. The thing that happens with disciplinary power is the truth of the procedures, the truth of the techniques, the truth of the cure is assumed in advance. Okay. And it's inaugurated and authorized by the fact that psychiatry exists as a science, okay? So within that science, you can make individual errors, exceptional errors, there can be moments of negligence, there can be, experiments that go wrong, there can be minor failures, but the science itself is true, okay? And like Foucault has a kind of lovely phrase where he says something like, it's the imprescriptible rights of freedom of reason over madness. Okay, so it's like reason is inviolably, unassailably good. Okay, this science of psychiatry is an outcropping or outbranching of reason. Okay, so it's validated in advance, and we don't need to think about truth anymore. Okay, because we constitute the science of psychiatry. Okay, these disciplinary procedures that we're subjecting the patients to is itself the science of psychiatry, or whatever the practice of psychiatry. Yeah. So the reason why hysteria, simulation are so important is because they in fact reintroduce the game of truth into the psychiatric scenario, and they say, look, I'm not going to allow you to read my behavior at all anymore. Okay, all those things that you said are symptoms of madness, yeah. All those things that you said are signs of disorder of the brain, all those like classificationary moves that you're making, this is mania, this is hysteria, this is monomania, etc. I can like spoof them, I can impersonate them. And therefore I can bring like those that I can bring, it's not even that they're bringing the methods into question, because what they're saying is that, I'm basically saying that there are no grounds for your science anymore. It's something, I don't know how to describe it, but it's something more radical than just bringing in methods into question. You have nothing to catch hold of because this is fake and this is simulacrum, and this is pretense, and you can't tell the difference, right? In fact, the very fact that I'm impersonating a disease is itself madness.
But can we talk about the detail here? Because he goes to great lengths to say, okay, but this is what he's basically saying is that, or talking about, is not a sane person simulating madness, right? There's a great art piece in Sweden. It was a big thing where someone actually did this, where they simulated a psychosis and got, confined and kind of sectioned or whatever, and then there was a whole drama with that. It's a kind of interesting detail apropos sane people faking madness. But what he's saying is that no, he's talking about mad people simulating madness, right? Or madness simulating madness.
But why are they mad in the first place?
You are.
But you've assumed that they're mad in the first place,
No, but he
That's
says
the question.
this. He says this himself, right?
What?
He literally says it. He says madness simulating madness. That's what he literally says.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So can I come at this from like a kind of like, as Foucault would put it, like the crayfish, advanced sideways. So a good friend of mine talked to me about a problem, and it's a real big problem in psychiatric hospitals and has been. I was watching some documentaries a few months ago now, and it was this kind of realization at that time that, well, these people actually, they're not mad, And so, the way in which Foucault talks in earlier lectures, right, is this notion of the residual. So that, any form of exclusion is actually only a means of to re-include, and that this thing kind of goes, like ad infinitum. So like in the school that me and Patrick worked at, you had this place called referral room. Then if you get sent there out of the class too many times, you go for a few days to this place called the Restorative Justice Centre. And then if they still can't, do anything with you, you might get like excluded from the school, go to another one, same process happens, then no schools will take you. And you end up in a place that resembles a prison called a pupil referral unit. And if your behaviour is so bad there that it becomes actually criminal, well, then you might end up in a kind of like youth prison, right? So, this kind of like this never-ending sequence of reintegrations exists. Now, the problem is that most people in psychiatric hospitals are not mad, right? They are just people who, they're going through a difficult time in life, or, the people who are actually severely disturbed are quite rare, in fact. And for those people, in the context of the current British kind of juridical system, and that's exactly what Foucault will move on to, right? Which is this coupling between madness, psychiatry, and justice. And he will talk about how madness emerged because it needed to, because of the Christian notion of intentionality, right? So in order to have an intention and commit a crime, well, one must be of sound mind. And just as a kind of structural fact, that to bring back my anecdote for a second, is that, my question all the time in those seminars is, well, what about men? Like, how can we be speaking about, so to have sound mind, you have to have unsound mind. And so for him, the psychiatric hospital becomes an essential kind of component of this broader system of justice, punishment, and discipline. Because in order to have sound mind, well, there has to be this exception. There has to be this exception where you are not in control of yourself. You are of unsound mind. Now, the current form, well, one current form of that is very complex, is this thing that's called being sectioned, right? So when you're sectioned, it means that you have lost capacity, that you don't have the capacity to make decisions for yourself. So it's not merely like a kind of panic attack or that you can be calmed down from. It's not even a severe depression that you cannot get out of. It's not an anxiety, it's where, like, fundamentally your capability, your disturbance has become such that you can no longer make decisions for yourself. Now, somehow, the system still entraps and entangles in and through this what seems like a very, very heavy judgment, right? To make upon a person. somehow that you get loads of people who are trapped within psychiatric hospitals because they have been sectioned. And the psychiatrists, it's kind of like what Patrick was talking about. They don't have an object to grasp onto, right? Because these people aren't mad. They're simply, they maybe had like an exaggerated moment of eccentricity that in a particular scenario was, exaggerated or exacerbated. And that, kind of brought into play certain actors like police officers or social workers or, whatever. And then, this person was to be deemed without capacity and was therefore sectioned and put into a hospital. And then some of these people, they end up spending ages and ages and ages in the hospital because there is no object, because there is no madness. There is therefore nothing to cure. So the hospital cannot release them without having gone through a procedure in which they have determined precisely the kind of madness which caused the loss of capacity, led to them being sectioned, and therefore in and through giving them, in the current kind of biomedical paradigm, especially in the UK, the appropriate medication, right? The appropriate diagnosis, the appropriate medication, such that they can say, okay, they have been sectioned because they suffer from this disorder. Having this disorder, well, it means according to our guidelines or our schema that we give them these kinds of drugs. Having given them these kinds of drugs, we have seen an improvement in their behavior or capacity or in which we can now say that they are released from the section, that they are released from hospital. And I can imagine, anthropologically, if you spent, enough time in psychiatric hospitals now, you would see precisely people, not madness simulating madness, but just, kind of eccentric characters who got there for whatever reason. And they have to simulate a madness, because without simulating a madness, they cannot liberate themselves from this kind of prison that is the hospital.
That's kind of hilarious, though, isn't it? Something so darkly hilarious about that. But the people who are locked up for good, like even in a position of greater despair than like the radically mad, the completely ungovernable and implacably mad, are the people that are not mad at all, because they can't be submitted and like funneled into the process of cure. Like that's just hilarious. That's exactly the kind of like aporia and blind spot of our society, isn't it? And I think like. Another like scenario that I can imagine, and it definitely like happens in schools as well, and that I think fits at least the vocabulary of Foucault's text a bit better, because I think almost you're going beyond Foucault there, like into something that's like even he's not addressing at this particular moment in time. But it's the setting of the psychiatric situation would send the sane person kind of mad and make a sane person start to act like a mad person, and that's what happens in schools. Like you came late, that's a warning. What? Another warning, talking back. But I didn't. 3 warnings outside the classroom. And they're like, are you serious, miss? You're an idiot. It's a kind of understandable response. This guy's just walked into a classroom. And he's already in this stupid choice chat, which you have to have with like a really tedious, like the guy called the duty principal, who's kind of like, a nominated hall monitor for that particular, section of the day. And it's just like, you can just imagine, like, that rage is, except for me, it's kind of like philosophically decent, like, but in the school system, it's further example of indiscipline, and that guy will get sent to RSC, and maybe he'll trash RSC if he's in a particularly crazy mood, and then he's like, look at what we've got on record now on the dossier for this guy's indiscipline, answering back twice to a teacher, okay, as soon as he walked into the classroom, screaming at her, insulting her, refusing a choice chat, going to the SRC, the Student Restore Centre, which is a kind of like prison-like outbuilding, and trashing it. He's gone, government needs to be out of the school, doesn't he? Whereas actually nothing happened in the first place. Literally, the thing that like triggered it all was nothing. But there's no way of telling a difference between that and someone who really has lost it. Someone who really is willing to go into a kind of guerrilla-like fury at the slightest provocation, because that's also possible. It's possible for someone to be deranged. Like it's possible for someone to be like have an incredibly light trigger when it comes to, conflict or confrontation and just going berserk. But if the school system is treating them both the same, then simulation completely fucks up its claim to truth. And I think there's something else like the psychiatric situation. Again, it's like it's more. I think there are other versions of this story, but the psychiatric situation is such that, in terms of atmosphere, environment, what you're subjected to, and so on, that then you start to manifest a fury against the institution, which is then instantly interpreted as you being further entrenched in madness, further captive to insanity. But I think stimulation is slightly different. Stimulation is like, well, we're going to start doing loads of weird things all the time, to try and like screw up your books, to kind of, so it'd be a bit like if a school kid, if many school kids walked into a classroom and started impersonating indiscipline, okay? So then the teachers no longer knew the difference between real indiscipline and impersonating discipline. Why, is there one? There wouldn't be one. There isn't one, actually. So,
But this is the curious thing where I'm like, what does he really mean? Because he says like hysteria simulates hysteria at some point, right? And I don't know. It's interesting that I don't know. It's interesting that he's for me, what he's suggesting is like, all right, you have this kind of actually fucked up like nosological, the categories are fucked, like the knowledge actually behind this is a bit, ooh, but you have psychiatric power, right? And then there is this element of that possibly patients, in a sense, conscious or unconscious, just starts imitating what they think. I mean, they see other patients, you can imitate the other patients. You can also imitate the expectation of the doctor, right? Which I think after a while you can start to understand. You want to be sick? Then I'll do it like this, right? But the funny thing for me is that, okay, but because he makes quite a big point about this simulation shit, and I think it's really interesting, or maybe I'm getting just stuck with it, because it comes kind of at the end, and then he says, this is the big thing, here.
yeah. But maybe for me,
let me just finish. What I'm thinking is that it seems to me that he seems to be talking, because it is not like, I don't think it's a coincidence that he says hysteria simulates hysteria, and he doesn't say psychosis simulates psychosis, because I guess that could be the case as well, right? But he seems to say that there are certain of these diagnoses maybe and all these kind of things that were also trends, simulations, in a sense, that they, you could see the signs, the doctors were looking for some stuff, and then it wasn't about being completely, I guess, I don't know, out of this world, or in a sense, completely losing your history, or in a true sense, psychosis. I'm just curious here what he talks about, because it seems like he has a quite precise point here.
Yeah, I don't know how to take it. One, I'd say, like, obviously simulation is not pretense, and so in some weird sense it's always kind of slightly involuntary, because you are actually becoming mad, and then I don't see why he should privilege hysteria, except from the fact that he's trying to intervene in a kind of discourse, isn't he? So that the kind of his radical reinterpretation of hysteria will be a direct challenge to the sort of hegemony and position of authority of psychoanalysis, which is founded precisely on seeing hysteria as a real madness, if you like. So the other thing, and obviously he has a kind of love affair with the hysterics that I was going to say Foucault, but that Luke mentioned earlier, or in a previous seminar. One thing I'd say though is that the kind of simulation that interests me is this thing where it's like, okay, like King George III, okay. One day they find him with his pants down, like covered in shit, and he starts hurling his own shit at the doctor. Now, the doctor must be inclined to take that as a symptom of madness, all right? But is it a symptom of madness, or is it a symptom of confinement? Okay, so that seems where simulation come into play, where there's absolutely no way of deciding whether something is a symptom of madness or a symptom of confinement. A symptom of like disorder of the brain, or a symptom, or a kind of like an allergic reaction to this implementation of psychiatric power, of disciplinary power. And so again, like simulation is such a kind of like slippery, sort of fragile word, but it seems to me it's almost like you don't simulate, like, well, you can simulate in football and stuff, but I don't believe that simulate is a kind of like deliberate act. Even the artists I imagine you were talking about, must actually slip into psychosis if it's simulation. So there is a moment where it's involuntary, where it just happens. You know, it's a kind of, it's an event.
Yeah, but then you also get drugged for real, right? So
Yeah, that's
not
what I'm
a
saying.
simulation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, but that's the point. There is, it destroys this distinction between the false and the real. You know, which is established in different contexts, in different ways. But in psychiatric context, it's established by a distinction between sane and mad. You know, and that's the knowledge that it disrupts, if you like.
You know, there was a moment there where I was trying to work out how to maintain the kind of richness of what Patrick was saying about simulation, but then like disqualify this particular instance of King George throwing the shit. And maybe I'll just quickly go through the process, and then how I actually realised that no, it's just a level of complexity deeper, and the simulation is on a different plane. So the reason why I initially wanted to kind of disqualify that as kind of an instance of simulation is because actually, you know, and Foucault talks about this, right? It's like a deeply symbolic act that was particular to that period, where the impoverished would express their rancor and hatred of the sovereign. You know, it was the most extreme kind of form of protest or rebellion. You know, before the act of, you know, kind of regicide or, you know, actual insurrection, was, you know, was to hurl one shit at the sovereign, right? You know, as
And those who had
went
nothing
past
else to
them,
hurl as well, the absolute poorest of the poor, you know. Like,
yeah. They all only had their excrement. But then I realised that actually no, the simulation is on a different plane, and it's precisely on the plane of the game of truth, right? Because by doing this act, because King George, though mad, is still the sovereign, right? He is still the sovereign. And so his act, therefore, is, because he is the sovereign, precisely an act of simulation. Because he, and again, it goes back to this notion in which, you know, what Patrick was talking about before, where what they're trying to do, in a sense, by simulating all of these different symptoms, is screw up the very possibility of an order, right? And King George is doing exactly the same thing. He's doing exactly the same thing. He's saying that this order to which you are subjecting me is absurd, because look what I can do that fits into your order. I can act as the peasant would in insurrection against the sovereign, but I am the sovereign. And so it's this complex game of kind of power, truth, simulation that he's playing there in this act of throwing shit. You know, he isn't merely expressing dissatisfaction as a peasant would, and therefore not simulating and, you know, participating in, you know, a symbolic act typical of or pertinent to that moment. He is simulating a certain state or category, but it is precisely not one of madness. Rather, it is the disjuncture between his or, you know, well, I don't know what Foucault would have to say on this. I'd have to let the brew and stew for a little bit, but, you know, his true or real status as the sovereign, and the kind of material state to which he has been reduced, right? You know, and Foucault also goes into all of this, you know, so that the way that the sovereign would always hear things, and so the room in which he is placed, you know, that there is no possibility of him hearing, you know, information that would be vital to the exercise of his sovereignty. You know, his attendants, who previously would be relays or nodes for his instructions or orders, are now integrated into this system of, you know, disciplinary power, where he is, you know, confined and forced to a certain regimentation. And, you know, again, usually he would be free at leisure. You know, when he eats is when he decides to eat. You know, dinner starts when he says. You know, so all of these things. So what he does in and through the act is he does not simulate madness. Rather, he stages or theatricalizes the absurdity of the category of madness itself by making real or manifest the absolute falsity of the scenario into which he's been inserted. You know, he declares as absurd, as ridiculous, as stupid, as false the status to which he has been reduced by engaging in the symbolic act of a peasant and throwing the shit onto the people who precisely are not sovereign.
I would just say that I know what you're saying. I would say that just some of the words you're using make it sound still slightly too rationalistic, as if it's a kind of like deliberate symbolic rejection of their knowledge. I think I agree with you, but I just like, this is how I tweak it very slightly. I'd say that assimilation occurs when you satisfy all the criteria, you know, all the predeterminations and all the specifications for the person who's interpreting you. So he basically says, what does he theatricalize there? Well, he theatricalizes an absolute loss of sovereignty. Okay, he's been told you're not the king anymore. Okay, you have to subject yourself to this disciplinary authority. So you have to be robbed of your sovereignty. So what he's done is he's got to the 0 degree of sovereignty. You know, he's picked up the shit of the lowest of the low, and so therefore, in a weird way, he's kind of like at the level of like what they're capable of reading. He said, well, I am without sovereignty. I'm so absolutely without sovereignty that I'm behaving like one of the lowest of the low. And yeah, in and through that throwing of the shit, he's actually affirmed an inverted sovereignty. You know, this so that he's produced this moment that collapses their categories, that collapses their particular order of knowledge, as Luke was saying, but in and through making something both satisfy what they're saying and also sabotage it. You know, that's what, because I think we need this word simulation to mean something. So it has to mean that, like, if the mad are simulating mad, then there has to be some sense in which the people who are the therapists or the psychologists that are looking at them can be like, yeah, this is an exemplary instance of madness. And yet at the same time think, but even though I'm calling it an exemplary instance of madness, there's an excess, there's a remainder that's unnerving me, that's uncanny, you know? And that excess or remainder makes me think, God, like, me calling it madness does nothing, you know? The system of knowledge that I use and as a tool and as an implement that requires me to call this madness doesn't actually discipline that thing, doesn't actually pin it down, you know, doesn't actually say everything about it. Does that make sense? Right? Also, by the way, my kids are turning savage in the background, so I'm going to have to.
Yeah. Should we leave the last word to Jakob and then
Actually,
wrap up for today?
Dervishes squealing, you know, and screaming, and spinning.
Oh, you have to take care of them. I don't know what to say. I mean, I thought there were many things, like also in these chapters, like the last two, I felt that he's a bit jokey. Like he's having a bit of fun. Like I feel he's talking about these marvelous instruments, and you know, like he's having ergotherapy, the working camps, you know, like all these kind of things where he's like making gags. I feel, which was quite nice to kind of see. I don't know what it is, but it's interesting. And then I thought also it was interesting that he kind of stronger now in these lectures returned to a kind of materialist, almost Marxist pure analysis, or he sets things up, or he's more explicit about what he's doing. And maybe you said this, Luke, before, or maybe I interpreted it, but I'm also thinking about that he does this, but he's just not acknowledging it in some cases, I feel. And it's nice when he actually uses the vocabulary that he's actually using, in a sense. I felt that was nice. But then I thought the really kind of interesting thing, I can't remember if it's 5, it's probably chapter or lecture 5. I mean, this whole thing with the family, and then I just took out a little quote from I think later in that chapter, which is, the family model is transferred into disciplinary systems, disciplinary techniques are transplanted into the family. And I thought that was like, I don't know, it summed up in some way a lot of what he was kind of investigating in that chapter. And I thought it was, that particular one I thought was like a kind of, like a really dense and interesting observation, or how he goes around all this family stuff, like how also that goes into psychoanalysis later and blah, blah, blah. And we have all these kind of developments of the nuclear family and all the things that have been before. And then also what I feel is Foucault's dream about, couldn't we just, go back to a society when the feudal order where the families were big and everyone was not surveilled and people were having fun out in the fields. I don't know, but that's just my intuition of what he actually kind of would like. But
I mean, there's a lot to be said about that. I would say, in relationship to his adoration of Bataille, You know, which there's a definite homology there. I think you're right that, you know, the fascination is more than the giddiness of, you know, a historian. You know, like there is a kind of like a genuine rapture. You know, there is some sense of like the sublime.
Oh shit! Well, I've got to go.
Yeah, all right, all right.
All right, it's all collapsing.
But
You
I
guys
was
can-
just, yeah, I was just going to say, all right, but yeah, Patrick, you can get off,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I'll
I've
just
got to go.
ask Jakob something.
Yeah, see you soon, Patrick.
So next week we were going to do the mid-season review. I was just wondering if you were, you know, kind of definitely going to be absent next week, or if there's like a chance you could make it, or just because, you know, maybe we could pick up on, you know, some of these things in a bit greater depth and detail. If I had like a little bit of chance to like look over some notes, you know, make some links. But, you know, like, of course, if you weren't able, then in the next, you know, because we're going to be doing 2 lectures a time after the review. So yeah, just if you just let me know, and then, yeah, hopefully all this, you know, kind of tech stuff and the, you know, the organization, like, you know, I've been traveling, Patrick's in Lille because it's Easter. You know, it's been a bit of a, you know, a bit of a clusterfuck, as they'd say in military terms. But hopefully, you know, next week, or certainly the week after, you know, all of these problems should be kind of ironed out. And yeah, I think that it comes down to this kind of, you know, it's the running before we're walking kind of problem, right? So because of, you know, you're both like sharp and smart, you know, that's why I was like the smart GITs, which I quite like. It's you know, it's kind of like taking us away in all of these different directions away from the text. Whereas I think, you know, in the review we can really kind of, you know, like go back to the text, and, you know, as all having had like a little bit of time of like settlement, and, you know, and maybe like you know, get our shovels out and, you know, dig a little deeper into specific passages, or so I mean, you know, have a think about it, and just, you know, like just let me know. Like, either way we can work something out.
Right, no, nice. Next week I can't, but it would have to be done later. But we'll see what we do.
Okay, all right, man. Well, nice one.
Very nice. All right.
Peace. Have a good night.
Bye for this time.